My brother looked me straight in the eye and said, "You have no idea what it's like to take risks." Then he asked for my apartment. Not to stay for a few weeks. Not to crash on the couch. He wanted me to hand it over so he could start over, after losing everything in yet another business venture. That's when I told him something I'd been holding back for years. And you have no idea what it's like to face consequences. But that argument didn't happen overnight. It started years earlier. Growing up, my younger brother Tyler was the family dreamer. He was always chasing the next big opportunity. Every few months he had a new business idea, a new investment plan, or a new path to becoming rich before 30. My parents loved it. They called him ambitious. They called him fearless. Meanwhile, I was the practical one. I went to college, got a stable job, paid my bills, and followed a predictable career path. Nobody called me ambitious. They called me responsible. Which, in my family, felt a lot less impressive. Still, things worked out for me. After years of grinding, I landed a position at a large international company. It was exactly the kind of job I'd been working toward. There was just one problem. The office was nearly 2 hours from my apartment. 4 hours of commuting every day. At first, I convinced myself I could handle it. I couldn't. After 2 weeks, I was exhausted. I was leaving before sunrise and getting home after dark. I barely had energy to eat dinner before falling asleep. Something had to change. That weekend, I brought it up during our usual family dinner. My parents exchanged a look. Then my mom smiled. "We might have a solution." I immediately knew they were hiding something. My mother asked, "Do you remember Grandma's apartment?" Of course I did. I practically grew up there. Every weekend as a kid, I spent hours sitting in her tiny kitchen while she spoiled me with homemade cookies and stories I'd heard 100 times. Mom continued, "The tenants moved out last month. The place is empty now." Then she dropped the part that caught my attention. "It's 5 minutes from your office." I nearly choked on my drink. The apartment was in the perfect location. "What's the rent?" I asked. Mom named a number. I agreed before she even finished the sentence. Honestly, it felt too good to be true. The conversation quickly shifted back to Tyler and whatever new project he was working on. That wasn't unusual. Family gatherings always found their way back to him. But I didn't care. For once, I had something exciting happening in my own life. The next morning, I went to see the apartment. And that's when reality hit. The previous tenants had absolutely destroyed the place. The walls were stained. The floors were scratched. Cabinet doors hung crooked. The only furniture left behind was an old gray couch sitting alone in the middle of the living room like it had been abandoned during an evacuation. Most people would have walked away. I saw potential. I called my mom. "Would you mind if I fix some things up?" She laughed. "Just don't turn it into something crazy. Other than that, do whatever you want." That was all the permission I needed. That night, I fell down a rabbit hole of renovation videos, furniture ideas, and design inspiration. And for the next 6 months, that apartment became my entire life. After work, I went straight there. Every evening. Every weekend. Every spare dollar. I painted walls. Installed shelves. Replaced fixtures. Refinished damaged flooring. Assembled furniture that came with instructions apparently written by people who hated humanity. I learned skills I never expected to learn. Whenever I couldn't figure something out, YouTube could. Slowly, the apartment transformed. Then one day, I walked through the front door and realized I was finished. The place looked nothing like it had 6 months earlier. For the first time in my life, I had built something entirely on my own. I stood there staring at it, feeling proud of every late night and every exhausting weekend. And there was one person I couldn't wait to show. My mom. So I invited her over. I thought she was going to be impressed. I had no idea that visit would set off a chain of events that would eventually put my entire living situation at risk. When my mom arrived to see the finished apartment, she did what she always did. She inspected everything. The walls. The floors. The kitchen. The lighting. She barely said a word while walking from room to room. I was nervous the entire time. Then she stopped, looked around one last time, and smiled. "It's beautiful." For a second, I thought I misheard her. My mom wasn't the type to hand out compliments. Especially not to me. Then she hugged me. A real hug. Not the quick, distracted kind I was used to. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I thought maybe things were finally changing. I was wrong. About 2 weeks later, we had another family dinner. This time, I actually had exciting news. I had been promoted. My salary increased significantly. I was given my own team to manage. After years of hard work, I was finally moving up. I waited for the right moment to tell everyone. Eventually, there was a pause in the conversation. So I jumped in. "Hey, I got promoted." I explained what happened and how excited I was. My mom nodded without even looking up from her plate. "Oh, that's nice, honey." That was it. 5 seconds later, the conversation shifted back to my brother. Like it always did. Apparently, his delivery company was in serious trouble. A larger competitor had entered the market. They had better technology, more drivers, more resources, and prices he couldn't match. Clients were leaving fast. The company was bleeding money. Then my dad announced something that caught me off guard. He and my mom had taken out a loan to help Tyler keep the business alive. I tried to be careful with my response. Are you sure that's a good idea? Everyone immediately went quiet. I wasn't trying to be rude. I was being realistic. The new company sounds huge, I said. Competing with them is going to be extremely difficult. My parents exchanged a look. Then came the lecture. You've never understood business, my dad said. My mom nodded. You've always chosen the safe path. Translation? Stay in your lane. Apparently having a stable career meant I wasn't qualified to have an opinion. Then Mom delivered her favorite line. Family helps family. At that point I dropped it. Their money. Their decision. Not my problem. At least that's what I thought. A few months later, everything collapsed. The business went under. Completely. I got the phone call from my mom on a Tuesday evening. Tyler's company had officially filed for bankruptcy. He and his wife Madison had moved back into my parents' house. Mom sounded devastated. Mostly for them. Madison is having such a hard time, she told me. I almost laughed. Madison had spent years reminding everyone she was married to a successful entrepreneur. Now she was sharing a guest room with her in-laws. I wasn't exactly shocked she wasn't handling it well. That weekend I went to family dinner like usual. The atmosphere was tense. Tyler looked exhausted. Madison looked angry. Dinner had barely started before Tyler launched into a speech about how hard he'd worked and how businesses fail all the time. Everyone nodded sympathetically. Then Madison spoke up. I can't keep living like this. The room went silent. She looked around dramatically. No offense, but I need my own space. And that's when everything changed. Tyler turned toward my parents. By the way, what happened to Grandma's apartment? The second he said it, my stomach dropped. I immediately answered. I live there. Nobody acknowledged that I'd spoken. Not one person. My mom smiled. Oh, Emily completely transformed that place. You should see it now. Then she started listing all the renovations I'd done. The floors. The kitchen. The furniture. Everything. Tyler and Madison exchanged a look. A very specific look. The kind people give each other when they've just had the same idea. And I knew. I couldn't explain why. But I knew. Something was coming. For the rest of the night, I barely heard the conversation. My instincts were screaming at me. Still, I tried to be rational. They're not actually considering giving away my apartment. That's insane. Nobody would do that. Right? 2 days later I got my answer. I came home after work thinking about dinner and what show I was going to watch. The second I unlocked my front door, I heard voices. Inside. My apartment. I froze. Then I recognized them. Mom. Tyler. Madison. I walked into the living room and found all three standing there. Looking around. Pointing at things. Discussing the apartment as if it were a model home. I stared at them. What are you doing here? Nobody answered immediately. I looked at my mom. You could have called. Nothing. You could have asked. Still nothing. Finally she shrugged. I'm the owner. The words hit me harder than I expected. I can come whenever I want. Then she looked away. And that's when I realized this wasn't a surprise visit. They weren't there to see me. They were there for a reason. And whatever that reason was, I had a feeling I wasn't going to like it. To understand how bizarre the situation was, you need to picture what happened next. Madison wasn't acting like a guest. She was acting like a buyer at an open house. She walked through every room, touching furniture, opening cabinets, examining decorations and commenting on things I'd spent months choosing. Then she walked into my bedroom. My bedroom. At that point, I wasn't just uncomfortable. I was angry. She checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the closets, every corner of the apartment. Meanwhile, Tyler stood there quietly, avoiding eye contact. That should have been my warning. Eventually, Madison returned to the living room and sat on my couch. My couch. The one I'd saved for months to buy. She crossed her legs, smiled, and said something that made my stomach drop. This place is perfect. Then she looked at Tyler. We can move in next week. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood her. What? The room went silent. I laughed nervously. Sorry, what exactly do you mean by that? Madison looked confused. As if I was the one being unreasonable. Then my mother stepped in. And everything became crystal clear. Your brother needs a fresh start. I stared at her. I live here. Nobody responded. I renovated this place. Nothing. This is my home. Still nothing. Then my mother finally looked at me. Actually, it's my apartment. The words hit harder than I expected. She continued. And I'm the one who decides who lives here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. For 6 months I had poured every spare dollar, every weekend, every ounce of energy into that apartment. I painted those walls. I repaired those floors. I bought every piece of furniture. I turned that place from a dump into a home. And suddenly none of that mattered. Then came the part that really stunned me. Mom folded her arms. The apartment is worth much more now. I already knew where this was going. Since the renovations increased its value, your rent will be adjusted. Adjusted? What a nice word for what she actually meant. The new amount was nearly triple what I'd been paying. I just stared at her. There was no way I could afford that. Not even close. And she knew it. Everyone in that room knew it. Tyler remained silent. Madison suddenly became fascinated with her phone. Neither of them said a word. Not one. Finally, Mom delivered the ultimatum. You have 1 week. Then they left. Just like that. No discussion. No compromise. No apology. 1 week. I stood alone in my apartment after the door closed. Part of me wanted to cry. Part of me wanted to scream. But another part of me was already making a plan. And that part won. Within an hour, I was searching apartment listings. By midnight, I had found one that worked. The next morning was the first time I'd called out of work in almost 3 years. I didn't care. This was more important. By 9 o'clock, I was touring the apartment. By 10, I had signed the lease. By 11, I'd paid the deposit. Then I called a moving company. Same-day service. Expensive. Didn't matter. I booked it. When the movers arrived that afternoon, I became laser-focused. Every item in that apartment had a story. And every item belonged to me. The couch. Mine. The dining table. Mine. The television. Mine. The shelves. Mine. The appliances I had purchased. Mine. Even the custom closet system I'd installed with my own money. Mine. If I bought it, it was leaving. The movers probably thought I was crazy. I spent hours directing everything. Take that. Load this. Careful with that one. Nothing stayed behind. Absolutely nothing. By evening, the apartment looked almost exactly like it had when I first walked in months earlier. Empty. Cold. Forgotten. The only thing left sitting in the middle of the living room was that ugly old gray couch the previous tenants had abandoned. The same couch I'd found on day one. I locked the door, placed the keys inside an envelope, dropped them off at my parents' house, and drove away. No note. No speech. No drama. Just gone. The next morning, chaos erupted. My phone started ringing before 7. Mom. Tyler. Madison. Again. I ignored every call, made coffee, sat down, and enjoyed the quiet. Only after finishing my entire cup did I decide to answer. The second I picked up, my mother's voice exploded through the phone. How could you do this? I almost laughed. What exactly did I do? How dare you empty the apartment? There it was. The real problem. Not that they'd kicked me out. Not that they'd tried to take my home. The problem was that I hadn't left them a fully furnished apartment. I stayed calm. Everything I removed belongs to me. Silence. I bought it. More silence. I have every receipt. Then she completely lost control. The screaming started. The insults followed. I won't repeat most of what she said. Some things are better left unsaid. When I hung up, Tyler and Madison immediately started flooding my phone with messages. Paragraphs. Voice notes. Demands. Accusations. I ignored all of it. For the first time in years, I felt strangely at peace. So I focused on my new apartment instead. I unpacked, decorated, settled in, started over. A month passed without any contact. No family dinners. No phone calls. Nothing. And honestly, part of me missed them. Not the drama. Just the routine. I wondered what was happening back at my parents' house. Was Mom still making her famous Sunday dinners? Had Tyler figured out his next business plan? Did Madison ever get the apartment she wanted so badly? I thought about those things more often than I'd like to admit. But I had no intention of reaching out. Then, exactly 1 month later, my phone rang. And the name on the screen told me the piece was officially over. For a while, I tried not to think about them. Sometimes I'd remember Sunday dinners. My mom's cooking. The routines I'd grown up with. And for a few seconds, I'd actually miss them. Then I'd remember being given 1 week to leave my own home. That usually fixed the nostalgia. Exactly 1 month after I moved out, my phone rang. Mom. I almost ignored it. Almost. But some stubborn little part of me still hoped she might call to apologize. So I answered. That hope lasted about 3 seconds. I didn't receive your rent payment this month. I actually laughed out loud. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. Of course you didn't. Silence. I don't live there anymore. More silence. You remember that part, right? The part where you kicked me out. Mom sounded genuinely confused. As if I was the unreasonable one. Well, we thought you would keep paying. I nearly dropped the phone. You thought I would what? She sighed dramatically. You know we're still paying off the loan we took out to help Tyler. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not concern. Not reconciliation. Money. Again. Mom continued. Tyler can't afford rent right now. I waited. Then she delivered the line I knew was coming. Family helps family. For a second I couldn't even respond. The audacity was impressive. You mean the same family that threw me out of my apartment? Silence. The same family that tripled my rent so my brother could move in? Nothing. Then I said something I'd wanted to say for years. It's interesting how family only seems to help family when Tyler needs something. That didn't go over well. Mom immediately switched tactics. I'm very disappointed in you. I laughed again. This time it wasn't nervous laughter. It was disbelief. That's funny. Pause. I was about to say the same thing. Then I hung up. And this time I was done. I blocked her. I blocked Tyler. I blocked Madison. I blocked my father. Every single one of them. No dramatic announcement. No final speech. Just silence. The next few months were surprisingly peaceful. Without constant family drama, I focused entirely on myself. Work was going great. My new apartment felt like home. And for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying everyone else's problems. Then one afternoon I met my cousin Rachel for coffee. Unlike the rest of the family, we'd stayed close. Naturally, the conversation drifted toward Tyler. Apparently things weren't going well. Not even a little. His first business had failed. Then he'd launched another one. That one failed too. Rachel told me my parents had been calling relatives asking for money. Aunts, uncles, cousins, anyone willing to listen. Nobody wanted to invest. Nobody trusted Tyler anymore. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. After hearing the same story for years, most people had reached their limit. Then Rachel told me something interesting. My parents were considering another loan. Another one. To fund another business idea. I just stared at her. At some point, the situation stopped being tragic and started becoming predictable. Rachel eventually asked what I thought. I took a sip of coffee. A few months earlier, that news would have ruined my entire week. I would have worried constantly. Felt guilty. Felt responsible somehow. But not anymore. So I shrugged. Not my circus. Rachel laughed. Not my monkeys? Exactly. And for the first time, I actually meant it. Or at least I thought I did. Because the truth was more complicated. My life was moving forward faster than ever. At work, I received another promotion. Then another major project. My salary increased again. I was finally reaching the level I'd always worked toward. Meanwhile, the people who called me boring for choosing stability were drowning in the consequences of their own choices. The irony wasn't lost on me. But something strange started happening. The farther I got from my family, the more I found myself thinking about Grandma's apartment. Not because I wanted to move back. Not because I missed living there. It was something deeper. That apartment wasn't just real estate. It was memories, birthday parties, holiday dinners, stories from my grandmother, pieces of my childhood. And every time I thought about it, the same question came back. Why had I walked away so easily? The more I considered it, the more it bothered me. I had invested thousands of dollars into that place. Hundreds of hours. And despite everything, I still felt connected to it. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something else. But I couldn't completely let it go. Then I learned something interesting. Tyler's latest business venture had crashed too. Apparently it was one of those online schemes promising easy money and fast success. The kind of idea that sounds brilliant for 5 minutes, and disastrous immediately afterward. The business failed almost as quickly as it started. My parents were desperate. The loans were piling up. Their savings were disappearing. And according to Rachel, they were running out of options. That's when a thought entered my mind. A dangerous thought. For the first time, I wasn't looking at their problems with sympathy. I was looking at them as an opportunity. And the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I had the money now. I had stability. I had leverage. All I needed was patience. So I waited. Not long after that, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in months. I didn't even need to answer to know who it was. My mother. And somehow, I already knew this call was going to change everything. A few weeks later, I got the call I had been expecting. The only surprising thing was how it happened. I had blocked my entire immediate family months earlier. So when my phone rang from an unknown number, I almost ignored it. Almost. Something told me to answer. I stayed silent. A few seconds later, I heard my mother's voice. Emily? There was hesitation in her tone. The kind that only appears when someone needs something. I couldn't help smiling. That's interesting. Silence. You haven't called me sweetheart in a long time. A heavy sigh came through the phone. Look, I know things ended badly. Ended badly. What a creative way to describe being thrown out of my home. I didn't respond. She kept talking. Your father and I are in a difficult situation. Of course you are, I thought. Then came the part I'd been waiting for. Tyler's business isn't doing well. Another surprise. Nobody could have predicted that. Except literally everyone. We need help. There it was. No apology. No accountability. Just a request. Money first. Feelings later. Or maybe never. I leaned back in my chair. And how many relatives did you call before me? Silence. That silence told me everything. My cousin had been right. They'd already gone through the entire family. Nobody was willing to fund Tyler's latest disaster. My mother tried to explain. It's not like that. It is exactly like that. Another silence. Then I decided to stop dancing around the issue. Fortunately for you, I might be willing to help. Her breathing immediately changed. Hope, desperation, relief, all at once. But I wasn't finished. I have one condition. The silence became even heavier. I could practically hear her preparing for impact. Grandma's apartment. No response. I want ownership transferred into my name. The line went completely quiet. Then came a weak attempt at resistance. But Emily... No. I cut her off immediately. No negotiations. Another pause. Longer this time. I continued. If Tyler's next business is really going to succeed, then this shouldn't be a problem. Still silence. You pay me back. Pause. And I return the apartment. Another pause. Simple. What I didn't say was the part both of us already knew. Tyler wasn't paying anybody back. Not this time. Not ever. Mom finally spoke. I need to discuss this with your father. Of course. I smiled. But don't take too long. Then I hung up. And waited. Honestly, I wasn't worried. I knew exactly how this would end. My parents had spent years making the same choice. Every single time. No matter the cost. They always chose Tyler. A few days later my answer arrived. Dad invited me over for what he called a serious discussion. The wording alone made me laugh. As if we were negotiating a corporate merger. Still I went. When I walked into their house the atmosphere felt strange. Heavy. Defeated. My mother sat at the dining room table. A folder rested in front of her. My father looked exhausted. Tyler stared at the floor. Nobody looked happy. That told me everything I needed to know. It's ready, Dad finally said. He pushed the folder toward me. Inside were the transfer documents. The apartment. Legally mine. Or at least it would be in a few minutes. I took my time reading every page. Not because I needed to. My attorney had already reviewed everything. Twice. I simply wanted to make sure they understood something. This wasn't happening because they trusted me. It was happening because they had run out of options. When I reached the signature page I saw all three names. My parents. Tyler's. Every required signature. Exactly where it needed to be. For a moment I felt something unexpected. Not joy. Not revenge. Closure. The apartment I'd poured my heart into was finally mine. Legitimately. No landlord. No favors. No conditions. Mine. Apparently my expression gave me away. Because my mother suddenly snapped. What's so amusing? The bitterness in her voice was impossible to miss. I looked up calmly. Nothing. I signed the final page. Then slid the documents into my folder. Just making sure nobody's trying to trick me this time. Mom's face tightened instantly. She looked away. Nobody spoke. The silence was almost uncomfortable. Almost. Finally I closed the folder and stood up. Well? 3 sets of eyes immediately turned toward me. Everything looks good. The tension in the room eased slightly. You can expect the money tomorrow. My father visibly relaxed. I hadn't realized how nervous he was until that moment. He let out a long breath. Thank you. Then he added something that almost made me laugh. I knew you wouldn't abandon your family. There it was again. Family. That word only seemed to appear when they wanted something from me. I didn't argue. I didn't point it out. I simply smiled. Because there was one detail nobody at that table seemed to understand. The money was never the most important part of this deal. The apartment was. And now, after everything that had happened, it finally belonged to me. What none of them realized was that this agreement was about to create a brand new problem. One they never saw coming. Of course, I said with a smile that wasn't really a smile. Family helps family, right? The room immediately became uncomfortable. Nobody liked hearing their own words thrown back at them. Especially when those words exposed their hypocrisy. A few weeks later the apartment officially became mine. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. Legally mine. And once the paperwork was finalized I started making plans. For years, that apartment had carried traces of other people's choices. My grandmother's. My mother's. Former tenants. Now it was finally time to make it my own. I hired contractors. Replaced the flooring. Updated the kitchen. Redesigned the bathrooms. Fresh paint. New fixtures. Modern furniture. Everything. The transformation was incredible. Every time I walked through the apartment, I felt a sense of ownership I'd never had before. Not because of the legal documents. Because I'd earned it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same apartment I had once been forced out of now belonged entirely to me. There was only one complication. Tyler and Madison still lived there. And now they were paying rent to me. The situation would have been funny if it wasn't so bizarre. To their credit they paid on time at first. Probably because they had no other options. But as the months passed, the tension became impossible to ignore. My mother started calling again. Not often. Just enough. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Could you give them a little more time? Or maybe you could lower the rent for a few months. Or my personal favorite. Your brother is trying his best. Whenever she said that, I felt the same irritation. Because nobody had cared about my struggles when I was working 60-hour weeks to build a stable life. Nobody had offered me discounts. Nobody had protected me from consequences. So my answer never changed. I understand. Boss. But the rent is still due. That usually ended the conversation. Then the deadline arrived. The repayment date. The day everything was supposed to be settled. I knew it was coming. And somehow I knew it wouldn't be simple. Mom called that morning. We need to talk. Her voice sounded strange. Heavy. Nervous. I already suspected what was happening. When I arrived at my parents' house later that evening, everyone was waiting. Mom, Dad, Tyler, Madison. Nobody looked comfortable. The atmosphere felt wrong. Like everyone had rehearsed a conversation they didn't want to have. I sat down. Okay. Nobody spoke. So what's going on? Dad cleared his throat. We have the money. That surprised me. A little. I raised an eyebrow. You do? Mom nodded quickly. We do. But something about her expression didn't match her words. She wasn't relieved. She looked anxious. Tyler wouldn't look at me. Madison looked like she wanted to disappear. That's when I knew there was more. Great. I leaned back. Then transfer it and we're done. Another silence. Then Mom finally said it. The apartment. My stomach tightened. What about it? We want it back. For a second I thought I'd misunderstood. Actually, I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. You want it back? Mom straightened her shoulders. We have the money now. So the apartment should be returned. The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. Almost. My smile disappeared. No. The room froze. Tyler immediately sat forward. What do you mean no? I mean exactly that. I kept my voice calm. The apartment is mine. Dad jumped in. Emily, that wasn't the spirit of the agreement. I looked at him. Really? Because I remembered the agreement perfectly. I had taken a risk. They had accepted the terms. Everyone signed willingly. Nobody was forced. Business is business. Or at least that's what Tyler always used to say. Now suddenly the rules were different. Interesting. Mom tried again. It was only supposed to secure the loan. That's not what the documents say. Silence. Then I asked the question that changed everything. Where did the money come from? Nobody answered. I looked around the room. Dad looked down. Mom looked away. Tyler clenched his jaw. And suddenly it clicked. Oh. I slowly nodded. No way. Nobody spoke. You borrowed it. More silence. My eyes widened. You actually borrowed money to pay me back. Still nothing. That was all the answer I needed. I laughed. Not kindly. Not politely. The kind of laugh that comes from pure disbelief. My God. I shook my head. You learned absolutely nothing. Mom immediately exploded. We had no choice. No choice. I stood up. You had plenty of choices. The room erupted. Everyone started talking at once. Excuses. Justifications. Blame. The same cycle I'd watched my entire life. Eventually Mom shouted loud enough to silence everyone. We couldn't lose that apartment. The room went quiet. I stared at her. Then I asked the obvious question. Why not? It's our home. The answer came instantly. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Our home. I repeated. You threw me out of that home without a second thought. Nobody responded. Because there wasn't a response. Tyler suddenly stood up. His face was red. Furious. You've always been jealous of me. I actually blinked. What? You always hated that I took risks. He pointed at me. You've been waiting for years to do this. For a moment I just stared at him. Then I realized something. He genuinely believed that. He couldn't imagine a world where his problems were the result of his own decisions. Someone else always had to be responsible. I stepped closer. The only thing I did was stop rescuing you. His jaw tightened. I continued. You're not a victim, Tyler. Silence. You're just finally dealing with consequences. Nobody said a word. Then I dropped the final piece. The one I'd been holding back. If you want to keep living in the apartment. Every head turned toward me. The room became completely silent. I paused intentionally. Then finished the sentence. The rent is increasing. Tyler stared. Mom stared. Dad stared. Madison looked horrified. I met all 4 pairs of eyes. Triple the current amount. The silence that followed was absolute. Because everyone in that room immediately understood exactly what I had just done. I had given them the same deal they once gave me. And they hated it. What? Madison whispered. Her face had gone completely pale. I simply shrugged. If you want to stay, pay the new rent. The room remained frozen. And if you don't want to pay it, you're free to leave. Mom looked like she might faint. Dad rubbed his forehead. Tyler stared at me in disbelief. This has to be a joke. I smiled. No. Then I stood up. This is business. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Years earlier they had used that exact logic whenever Tyler's decisions hurt other people. Now they didn't seem to like hearing it. I grabbed my bag and headed toward the door. Before leaving I looked back one last time. You have until the end of the month. Then I walked away. And left them alone with the consequences. The following weeks were surprisingly quiet. No phone calls. No emotional speeches. No attempts to negotiate. Nothing. Which immediately made me suspicious. My family had never accepted defeat that easily. Something was happening. I just didn't know what. Eventually the deadline approached. Then my cousin Rachel called. And what she told me made me laugh so hard I nearly dropped my phone. The story about borrowing money? Completely fake. Every bit of it. There was no predatory lender. No financial emergency. No desperate last-minute rescue plan. The whole thing had been an act. A carefully rehearsed story designed to manipulate me. Apparently, they believed that if I thought they were in serious trouble, I'd feel guilty enough to return the apartment. After everything, they still thought I was that easy to control. Honestly, that revelation changed something inside me. Because until then, part of me had still felt conflicted. Part of me wondered if I had been too harsh. Part of me still remembered family dinners and childhood memories. But hearing that erased a lot of sympathy. They hadn't learned anything. They were still trying to get what they wanted through guilt and manipulation. The same pattern. The same behavior. Just a different situation. So I stopped second-guessing myself. I followed the agreement exactly as written. No shortcuts. No emotional decisions. When the repayment deadline arrived, the money appeared in my account. Every cent. Exactly as promised. And suddenly everyone expected the apartment to magically become theirs again. The problem? That wasn't what the agreement actually said. At least not the way my attorney interpreted it. And after everything that had happened, I wasn't interested in doing anyone favors. Especially not people who had spent months trying to manipulate me. So I made a decision. One that I knew would start a war. The following weekend, Tyler and Madison left for the day. As far as I knew, they were visiting my parents. That gave me a window. I called several friends. People I trusted. People who knew the entire story. Together we spent the day clearing the apartment. Carefully. Legally. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was thrown away. Everything was packed and documented. Every box. Every item. Every personal belonging. By evening the apartment was empty. Tyler and Madison's possessions were safely stored in my parents' garage. Accessible whenever they wanted them. But no longer inside my property. When I stood alone in the apartment afterward, I felt something strange. Relief. Not victory. Not revenge. Relief. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, nobody else had control over that space. Nobody could take it away. Nobody could threaten me with it. It was finally over. Or at least I thought it was. A few hours later my phone exploded. Mom. Dad. Tyler. Madison. Again. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to discuss. Soon enough they showed up at my apartment. All four of them. Furious. The moment I opened the door, Tyler started yelling. What the hell is wrong with you? Madison was crying. Mom looked horrified. Dad looked exhausted. The entire scene felt familiar. For years, every family crisis had ended exactly like this. Everyone angry. Everyone emotional. Everyone expecting me to fix it. Not this time. How could you do this? Mom demanded. You crossed a line, Dad added. I looked at all of them. Then calmly answered. The apartment belongs to me. Silence. Complete silence. For a moment, nobody knew how to respond. Because they knew I was right. Tyler recovered first. You're unbelievable. No. I shook my head. I just stopped being convenient. That made him even angrier. His face turned bright red. You stole our home. I almost laughed. Your home. The words hung in the air. Interesting. I stepped forward. Because when I lived there, nobody seemed concerned about whose home it was. Nobody answered. Again. Because there wasn't an answer. Madison suddenly pointed at me. You took everything from us. I shook my head. No. Then I corrected her. I bought the apartment. Pause. I loaned you money. Pause. I honored every agreement. Another pause. You lied. The silence that followed was brutal. They knew about the fake story. And they knew I knew. My mother finally tried to speak. But I stopped her. Not angrily. Just firmly. No. She froze. I've listened to explanations my entire life. Nobody spoke. Your belongings are safe. I pointed toward the street. They're at Mom and Dad's garage. Then I looked directly at Tyler. If you want them, go get them. For the first time all evening, nobody had anything to say. Because the truth was painfully simple. The rules only felt unfair now because they were finally being applied to them. If you want your things, go get them. I pointed toward the driveway. But you're never living in that apartment again. The silence was immediate. Dad looked genuinely shocked. You're kicking us out? The question almost made me laugh. A few years earlier they had given me 1 week to leave. Now suddenly eviction was unacceptable. Yes. I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Nobody spoke. Tyler looked like he was seconds away from exploding. His hands were shaking. His face was bright red. But for the first time in my life, none of that intimidated me. Because they had lost the one thing they'd always used against me. Influence. They couldn't guilt me. They couldn't pressure me. They couldn't threaten me. They had no power left. Then I remembered one final thing. I pulled out my phone. Everyone watched. Confused. I opened my contacts. Blocked Mom. Blocked Dad. Blocked Tyler. Blocked Madison. One by one. Right in front of them. The room went silent again. There. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Now we're done. Then I stepped back inside. And closed the door. Art. The shouting started immediately. Tyler pounded on the door. Mom yelled my name. Dad tried to reason with me. I ignored all of it. I turned on the television. Sat on my couch. And enjoyed something I hadn't felt in years. Eventually they left. The house became quiet again. For a while that seemed like the end. But it wasn't. Because people like Tyler never accept consequences quietly. A few months later, my cousin Rachel called with an update. Apparently, my family was taking legal action. I nearly spit out my coffee. They're doing what? Rachel laughed. They're suing you. I laughed too. For a long time. Not because lawsuits are funny. Because this particular lawsuit was ridiculous. Everything had been documented. Every payment. Every contract. Every transfer. Every conversation that mattered. I had lawyers involved from the beginning. The apartment belonged to me legally. There was no ambiguity. No loophole. No hidden agreement. Nothing. But apparently that didn't stop them. According to Rachel, Tyler claimed the apartment was only supposed to serve as temporary collateral. Once the loan was repaid, ownership should have returned to the family. At least that was their argument. The problem? None of that existed on paper. And when you're talking about property, paper matters. A lot. Eventually the court date arrived. I wasn't nervous. Honestly, I was curious. I wanted to hear how they planned to explain this. When I entered the courtroom, my family was already there. Mom looked exhausted. Dad looked defeated. Tyler looked angry. Madison was nowhere to be seen. Maybe she'd finally realized this was hopeless. Maybe she simply didn't want to watch. Either way, she wasn't there. The hearing began. My attorney started with the basics. Property records. Transfer documents. Signed agreements. Bank transactions. Simple. Plain. Easy to understand. The judge reviewed the paperwork carefully. Then looked directly at Tyler. Do you have documentation supporting your claim? Tyler hesitated. The courtroom became very quiet. Finally he answered. No. The judge waited. Tyler continued. But there was an understanding. Not a great start. The judge raised an eyebrow. What kind of understanding? A family agreement. The words sounded weak even coming out of his mouth. My attorney immediately responded. Your Honor, there is no written agreement requiring the property to be returned. The judge nodded. My attorney continued. The ownership transfer was completed legally. More documents were handed over. More signatures. More records. Everything pointed in the same direction. The apartment belonged to me. The judge reviewed everything again. Then looked back at my family. So let me understand this correctly. Nobody moved. You voluntarily signed ownership over. Silence. You completed the transfer. More silence. You never filed any challenge to the transaction. Still silence. And now you want the property returned because of an alleged verbal agreement? Nobody had an answer. Tyler opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Mom stared at the floor. Dad looked exhausted. The judge sighed. The kind of sigh people make when they're tired of nonsense. Then came the decision. Short. Simple. Final. Case dismissed. The gavel struck. And just like that, it was over. At least legally. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. The fight that had consumed years of my life was finally ending. The apartment was mine. The lawsuit was gone. The constant conflict was finished. Or so I thought. Because as I reached the parking lot, I heard someone call my name. And when I turned around, I saw a face I hadn't expected to see at all. The judge's ruling hit them harder than I expected. Tyler's face went completely white. Mom covered her mouth with both hands. Dad didn't even try to argue. For the first time in years, there was no excuse left. No speech. No manipulation. No way to blame someone else. They had lost. Completely. As I walked out of the courthouse, I expected to feel victorious. Instead, I felt something much simpler. Relief. The kind of relief that comes after carrying a weight for far too long. The apartment was mine. Legally. Permanently. And nobody could take it away. Behind me, Tyler stormed down the hallway without saying a word. His eyes were full of anger. Mom couldn't even look at me. Dad just kept walking. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody apologized. Nobody tried to fix anything. That was the last time I ever saw any of them. After that day they disappeared from my life completely. No phone calls. No texts. No surprise visits. Nothing. It was as if I no longer existed. And honestly, I was okay with that. At first, I'd occasionally wonder what happened to them. Not because I missed them. Just curiosity. Did Tyler ever finally learn his lesson? Did he start another business? Did it fail too? Did my parents ever realize how much they had sacrificed for him? I don't know. And eventually I stopped caring. Because for the first time in my life, their choices weren't my problem. My life kept moving forward. My career continued growing. I received another promotion. Then another raise. The apartment generated extra income every month. My savings grew. My future felt secure. Everything I had worked for was finally paying off. Meanwhile, I couldn't ignore the irony. For years, Tyler had been the golden child. The future millionaire. The visionary entrepreneur. The risk taker. The son who was supposedly destined for greatness. Every failure had been explained away. Every mistake had been forgiven. Every disaster had become someone else's responsibility. Usually mine. But where had all those risks gotten him? Back to square one. Again. And me? I was the boring one. The office worker. The daughter nobody bragged about. The practical child who played it safe. The one who was constantly told she didn't understand ambition. Yet somehow, I was the one who ended up financially stable. I was the one with a successful career. I was the one building a future instead of chasing fantasies. And that's when I realized something. The biggest difference between Tyler and me wasn't luck. It wasn't talent. It wasn't intelligence. It was accountability. Every time something went wrong in my life, I adapted. I worked harder. I solved the problem. Every time something went wrong in Tyler's life, he looked for someone to rescue him. Usually our parents. Sometimes me. Eventually that catches up with you. And it finally caught up with him. The part that still amazes me is how unnecessary all of this was. If my parents had treated me fairly from the beginning, if they hadn't pushed me aside every time Tyler needed saving, if they hadn't tried to force me out of my own home, I probably would have helped. Not because I owed him anything, but because that's what families do when there's mutual respect. Instead, they made a different choice. They chose favoritism. They chose manipulation. They chose Tyler. Again. And again. And again. Eventually, those choices cost them everything. As for me, I moved on. I built my own life. I stopped waiting for approval I was never going to receive. And I never looked back. Sometimes I still think about that night when Tyler smirked and told me I didn't understand what it meant to take risks. Maybe he was right. I never understood risking everything on unrealistic dreams. I never understood expecting other people to clean up my mistakes. I never understood demanding that families sacrifice themselves for my bad decisions. What I did understand was responsibility. And in the end, responsibility won. So now I'm left wondering. Aita for refusing to give the apartment back and ultimately forcing my family to live with the consequences of their own choices?